The cemetery to me means a place of rest, a place of peace. It was a place that we could go because it was the only place that you could bury blacks in.
This cemetery holds the bodies of people who were loved. I would hear stories of times when vandals would go in and destroy.
If you let Oak Cemetery pass away, we all will be losers.
African-American cemeteries, such as Oak Cemetery in Fayetteville, Arkansas, are scattered all over the South. They serve as a constant reminder of a dark time in our nation's history, a time when segregation and racism plagued our communities. Today, the history of many of these burial grounds is lost.
Prior to this cemetery being formed, the slaves were buried wherever the family was. And like, for example, up by the Confederate cemetery, you'll find sunken graves because the slaves were buried not in coffins, and so it would just sink down. It's very poignant to see those. They're just lost in time.
On Independence Day 1867, the founding fathers of Fayetteville, Arkansas, sold a plot of land to the colored people of Washington County. The cost? $10. The land was used to build Oak Cemetery, a segregated burial ground.
The legacy of the cemetery started out with having to be the only place where African Americans could be buried, where you could cherish your loved ones, where you could visit their graves. It harkens back to the times of racism, fear. It just goes back to the mindset of you have your own, we have our own.
Everybody who died in the community may have been buried there, but there will be no recollection of the person. As poor as the people were, they may not have had money to either purchase a headstone or one of these little markers, and eventually nothing would be left of who was buried there.
University of Arkansas professor Dr. Gordon Morgan spent part of his career researching Oak Cemetery.
You'd go from one row to the other, looking at the names, looking at the dates that people died, taking all the information down that you could about a particular person. So the list that we got is only a partial list because we were not able to know from the record who was in fact buried there because those markers have disappeared.
It always seemed like a dumping ground, not a cemetery. That was my early feeling about putting your loved one's body there. Out of sight, out of mind.
One story that had been silenced for decades details the legacy of a man who broke the color barrier. Patrolman Lem McPherson was buried in Oak Cemetery in 1928, but no headstone marked his final resting place.
Mr. McPherson himself and the entire incident had slipped through, the sands of time, just had been lost. A tragedy that happened in the early 20th century that we knew nothing about. You are talking about, the 1920s. This was also still a town in the South, not too terribly long after the Civil War. Segregation was still fully in swing.
White residents would refer to the black section of town as Tin Cup or the Hollow, derogatory terms that conjure up negative images and strong emotions for many.
Your section of town was always nicknamed, and you had to swallow that.
It is set in a deep vale between the business section of Fayetteville and the foot of the neighboring Mount Sequoia. The city jail, like a menacing shadow, is outlined on the crest of the slope on the western sky. This perhaps serves as a warning to some. Sometimes there is a killing, sometimes there is a shooting scrape. Mary Schilling, 1928.
Anything that went on in the black community had practically to be settled within that community.
Until Patrolman Lem McPherson was hired by the Fayetteville Police Department. He was the first African-American officer in the city. He only had authority in the black section of town.
You're right in the middle of Prohibition, in the late 1920s, and it was a very different area.
Everett Williams lived in the Hollow. He was a well-known bootlegger. On April 28, 1928, he had recently been released from jail after serving 9 months.
He thought some men had been seeing his wife while he was in jail, and one of them he thought was Patrolman Lem McPherson. Early in the evening, Everett Williams actually stole a shotgun from somebody's house over here and went looking for McPherson.
Officer McPherson was just greatly outgunned. From some of the witness statements we heard, Mr. Everett made the statement, "I've got you now."
He was hit 2 times. He was hit on the back and shoulders and around the head. The 12 gauge won, and Patrolman McPherson was killed.
2 other officers gave chase, fired some shots at Mr. Everett, who was fleeing the scene, but did not hit him at that time.
Everett Williams hid outside of town to the east, out by the Stone Bridge.
A tip led police to Williams.
They were able to take him into custody, had him in the back of a car, but did not have him handcuffed. Came to a stoplight close to the intersection of Center Street. He jumps out of the car, takes off running, all the time yelling, "Don't shoot me, don't shoot me."
Thursday night, May the 3rd, 1928, Everett Williams decided to surrender. He was afraid of being strung up before the trial, is what he said at the time. And he was really hungry and tired and, of course, scared to death. Trial began on Monday, May the 7th, 1928, and they had a jury of 12 white men, and they convicted Everett Williams, and Judge Maple sentenced him to 21 years in the Arkansas State Penitentiary.
Patrolman Lem McPherson was buried in Oak Cemetery. He was 48 years old. His grave remained unmarked. His story would remain untold for more than 80 years.
My great-grandmother and great-grandfather are buried side by side. And I imagine that my grandmother and grandfather, the Manuels, they are side by side. But I wouldn't know where to go.
Betty Davis was born in Fayetteville in 1925.
We had a family plot, and all the older people were buried in the family plot. I know my grandfather was buried in that end. I would say that this is a grave marker from an era when people didn't have money to buy headstones, but they had to have some way to identify a family's grave.
There was only one mortuary that would accept the blacks. Sunday was funeral day, and everybody left the churches, whichever church, Baptist or Methodist, and went to the cemetery.
Today, many influential African Americans who lived through segregation and integration rest peacefully in Oak Cemetery. They spent their lives fighting for change.
It was a struggle of patience. We couldn't just go to the city council meeting. You had to be invited to a special set-up meeting, and it was a struggle of being degraded to the point, well, you know, you're over in the holler, you don't need this.
They knew it would be an uphill climb in that day and age because African American communities were the last to get anything. But their resilience is what helped them to get the things that were needed.
We got streets, water, and sewer. That meant that we got fire protection, police protection. That meant that we were beginning to be a part of the city.
It couldn't have been done unless people were willing to step across that line.
My spot's already picked out. It's a corner spot. I'm not one to be in with the mix. I took over where Dad left off because it was something that my father had done throughout the years, was to take care of the cemetery.
A small group helps maintain the cemetery, but it's a big task.
I don't think there's a lot of emphasis on taking care of the cemetery.
Next spring break, I won't be here because you're volunteering for this.
Oak Cemetery faces a major problem in the future. Fewer than 100 burial plots remain available.
We're kind of landlocked in. We've got the National Cemetery on one side. We've got people's property on the other side. Therein lies the next problem, which is it's not a funded cemetery.
The story of Patrolman Lynn McPherson won't slip through the cracks again.
We need to honor this man. We always talk in the police communities of making the ultimate sacrifice. This gentleman did.
A new fallen officer's memorial bears his name.
In the police subculture, we always like to think that, we remember the fallen that we have. We don't want to forget their sacrifice. We want to make sure that it is remembered for future generations, for his family, for the memory of what he did, and for the memory of the department.
The police department commissioned a new headstone in Oak Cemetery to mark Patrolman Lynn McPherson's final resting place.
We then conferred with some of the other family members, and that was Officer McPherson's grave.
I think it's important to keep the connection alive, and I think it's important to hear their stories. I think the legacy of the cemetery is one of truly looking to your past to see if you can do better in the future.
Oh no, that's my grandfather. That's my great-grandfather. That's my great-grandfather. 1845. Yes. 1912. Yes. Oh. I'm sorry. I thought it was all gone. Grandma Taylor is buried near here. She's next to him someplace. This is probably her grave because she's buried beside him. This is the individual that started this family. Grandpa, God bless you. I thank you for having started this family. We all owe you. God is good.
Oak Cemetery faces an unknown future, but those who understand the sacrifices made by many who rest here want to preserve the past and honor the memory of those who fought for equality.
It was a community that was made possible by people who had suffered. This community was set up by freed slaves. That's awesome. These are people who had nothing, and they were able to create and make something. I'm proud of that. And this is why I don't want their lives to have been in vain.